Happy Friday the 13th. You are listening to Abyss Gazing, a horror podcast.
I'm your co-host, Mark,
And I'm your co-host, Josh.
and we have Anthony with us today talking about Jason X.
Hello, guys. Thanks for having me.
Of course, this has been a tradition. If you guys are new to this tradition, Anthony and I have been covering every Friday the 13th movie on Friday the 13th for like the past 4 or 5 years. All the episodes are on the Victims and Villains feed. We'll provide a link in the descriptions below. But moving forward, all of the Friday the 13th will be here exclusively on Abyss Gazing. And we're going to space for this adventure, guys.
Jason,
All right, I'm glad.
Jason X lives in infamy with everybody.
So before we jump into this, and before we get really deep into this, I'm curious. So it's this underlining rule within the horror community that if a franchise goes to space, there is no coming back for it. Do you guys believe this?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question about that. I mean, Jane going to space, Leprechaun going to space. Which Hellraiser was it in space? I don't even remember.
Bloodlines.
Or Bloodline.
Yeah. Well, see, but Hellraiser survived that. There were a lot of Hellraisers after that.
It depends on who you ask, because some people are like, man, those
Sure.
direct-to-video era Hellraisers are just absolutely terrible.
Yeah,
Very true.
I mean, and the bad thing is with Jason X, the way they set it up, it almost seemed like, this is going to do well enough. We're going to do another sequel. That's the scary part.
No, that I think that was the beyond scary part. Yeah. At the end, that warned you there might be another. Scariest part of the movie.
Well, so I feel like what's the scariest part about this movie before we get too deep into this is that this movie. So for those guys that caught our last episode, basically, Jason went to hell. Supposed to be the last Friday, and New Line acquired the rights. New Line acquiring the rights basically meant that after years of trying to do it, they could finally do a Friday versus Nightmare, Freddy versus Jason, and we'll be discussing that one later this year. But this one, correct me if I'm wrong, they spent 8 years developing Freddy versus Jason, and then this one came about randomly, I think, to keep the rights. Am I in the clear with saying that?
Maybe. I know right along this time period, you had a few franchises that went to space. You had, Dracula 3000
Oh God.
with Coolio and
Yeah.
was it Dana D'Errico, I think. What else? There was a couple of them that went to space, and it was just like, what were you people thinking? This is dumb.
And so I also think New Line instantly regretted this movie because it was done and prepared for release in 2000 and didn't actually come out into theaters until April 2002.
It felt like when you watch it, it felt like what I remember old school Syfy channel exclusives felt
Right?
like in the day.
Yep. That's
Like-
exactly what it looked like too.
Yeah, like it could have been a really long episode of Stargate SGU or something.
Yeah.
It was bad, but it was
Yeah.
fun at the same time.
Yeah, so when we first started this whole journey, I had never seen a Friday the 13th. And so that's the reason that Anthony and I started doing this. And then probably about halfway through this, just us going through this, I ended up buying the Shout Factory gorgeous Blu-ray set and watched all of them. And so I remember the first time I'd seen this, everyone was like, "Oh, this movie's terrible," blah blah blah, and I really gave into that hype. I was like, "This is the worst Friday," blah blah. I no longer think that goes to Manhattan 100%. But this one, it Mark, Mark Anthony,
Really?
you guys said it, yeah. It's the lowest one in my book. I will explain why Freddy versus Jason and the remake are not anywhere near that bottom. But yes, the worst one in my opinion is Manhattan. This one is like circles the bottom, but I think on this viewing, like I had a lot more fun with this one because like I kind of knew what to expect. I was really dreading it, and I think just like the silly and like goofiness and the like the overtopness, I was just like, oh, they're committing to this. I like the fact that like we open up and they are like 100% committing to the fact that like Jason is supernatural. It's no longer a secret. We're studying him. Jason is science. Like the right out the get-go, like you are like thrown into this like over the top campy environment that I feel like is actually an improvement upon like what they tried to do with Jason Goes to Hell in the prologue. And I know that's probably a hot take, but I love the fact that they like actually committed to the insanity of, is he supernatural? Is he not?
I mean, Jason was always supernatural.
Yeah, but this is like the first time in the franchise that they've like really, I don't want to say owned up to it, but this is the first time that they've like really like doubled down and just like really went with like the whole like ludicrous idea of this man can die.
But there's
well, and I
nothing.
don't even think that they. Oh,
Go ahead.
didn't really take a supernatural at least in my opinion, they didn't get it from a supernatural stance. They were the whole thing was about like it was this whole scientific approach because they talked about how like he somehow is able to regenerate on his own and we need to find out why. Like his cells regenerate. Like they literally went down this whole science route with it, and it was just funny to see that. It's like, why can he regenerate? And then it brought a question in my mind of like, is the entire future of like regenerating people through cryogenics and everything like that built off of the fact that Jason can do this?
Yes. Also, it should be worth mentioning that for the first time in the franchise that this one also want to shout out because this is the second David Cronenberg movie we've covered. Go check out our episode on Crimes of the Future. But poor Cronenberg, I feel like he's way too talented to be here, but to each his own.
Yes.
He has he has a tendency to play in these little roles like this.
Which is I feel like if you want to see a better version of that, go watch Nightbreed.
It's well, I mean, he was in Star Trek Discovery in like the last season. He played like a psychologist or something like that.
Interesting. Okay. He's also in the Shudder original series slasher Flesh and Bone.
Yeah, he has a tendency to play these little roles like this where it almost seems like he's not doing it for career wise, almost more like I'm kind of bored and this seems like it would be dumb and fun.
That's probably the best assessment right there because there's no other explanation for doing this movie.
I don't know. Like imagine like I just imagine like they came to Cronenberg and they're like, "All right, sit down. We're about to blow your mind." Jason has done literally everything else. He's been at Camp Crystal Lake for 7 movies. He went to Manhattan for 20 minutes. He went to hell, and we're about to send him where no slasher's gone before. Space.
Well, and you can and you can definitely tell that they only that he only wanted a small role because, in my opinion, he could have played the professor and obviously nailed that part way better than the actor who did play the professor.
Yeah, I would be down for that.
Was there really any good actor in the movie?
Yeah, Kane Hodder.
Yeah, I was about to say, I was like, Kane Hodder. I mean, like, you can literally say anything negative about this, and like, Kane Hodder still earns the respect.
I mean, he's been playing the same kind of role for like infinity, so it's kind of expected that he would do a good job. But outside of walking around like a giant brute, you can't really credit anybody else.
Definitely not.
Speaking of the professor, are we gonna bring up the fact that like there's like this like weird scene where he's like his character is like given like an SMM fetish for whatever reason. It just
It's
seemed like really
it's
random.
that serves no purpose in the movie
Yeah.
whatsoever,
Like character development.
other
Yes.
than he's into nipple twisting, purple
Yeah.
nurbles.
Well, is it also sad that he's the character in the film who had the most character development, quote unquote?
Well, I mean, I feel like you couldn't call this a Friday the 13th or a Jason Voorhees movie without any character development. I would probably say that up until this point in the franchise, the person that feels the most developed are the Voorhees, Pamela and Jason. Like outside of that, there's nothing to really sink your teeth into. These are really mindless movies.
Mm-hmm.
But
No,
could you also call it a Friday the 13th movie or Jason movie without pointless nudity too? So it kind of
Oh,
goes in multiple directions in this movie. They
I
cover it all in stupidity. So
yes.
I need to like we need to address the fact too that like two of the characters are like off having like the beginning of sex. So they're like in the foreplay mode and Jason cryostasis like state frozen shut magically gets awakened by the sound of like a girl like tossing in bed. What?
Well, that's his internal alarm clock.
somebody's having fun. Let me ruin it.
Yes.
It's
Yep.
Well,
I hear sex.
I I love too the fact that like when he goes through like the stimulation in the end, as they're like trying to like get around him, where there's the two counselors and they're like, we love drugs and we love premarital sex, and like they double down and emphasize, yeah, premarital sex is the best. It's like, is this what this franchise has come to? Like, I don't feel like we're
but
even trying anymore.
but it's like the best kill scene in like the entire movie where he beats another person to death with another person in a sleeping bag.
Yes.
I is that what you guys are going for best death? Because I
No.
would argue
That was
that
funny.
it was funny and it's a great callback to like one of the best sequences and best deaths in the franchise. To like the sleeping bag gag is like one of everyone's favorites, but I would argue that in this movie it is the girl that has her face frozen with liquid nitrogen and then is smashed. Like that's probably my favorite death.
Yes. No, I think that's the best step too, and for two reasons. One, it looked really cool, and two, I think they spent about 80% of their budget on that.
He's probably not wrong.
Yeah.
Well, because how many deaths happened? Like that was the other thing too, watching the deaths in this movie. How many, like a good number of them happen off screen. I think we've seen more severed heads in this one than we've seen in any other one. Just yeah, like they go to space and a lot of the deaths were just very uninspired.
Yeah. I feel like they started off strong and like I coming back into this for a rewatch, like I didn't really remember a whole lot about anything in this movie. I was like, okay, cool. Jason goes to space. I'm really dreading this episode. It's one of my least favorite in the series. And then like he comes back to life, kills the scientist, and I was like, okay, all right, let's get creative with these deaths. It's about freaking time. And then it never rises to that. Like it's like they set the bar up so high and then they slowly just go down until you're like, yeah, quickly.
I mean, I don't think the bar was ever set very high from the get go in this movie. So, yeah.
Nope. I mean, yeah, the lot right from the start was just, like, again, I always tend to overanalyze these movies because they are like just dumb fun. But you know, having to force Jason in a cryogenic chamber, but then if you're out, you know, if you're sitting in the room, you can still be cryogenically frozen safe for 400 years. I think. Yeah, I mean, just leave your brain home when you watch this one for sure.
Yeah.
You're not watching this one for its intelligence. If you're watching
Nope.
it, it's because of how cheesy it is. And it falls in that category of horror that's so cheesy, it's fun. It's
Yes,
just,
I agree.
that's the kind of horror it is. It's not a serious slasher by any means. I think they knew what the franchise was. Is like, you know what? We're gonna run with it and we're gonna make it obvious. So that's
So
the only explanation I have.
I'm actually really glad that you brought that up, because I started off this podcast talking about the history of this film and got a few facts wrong. So this movie is written by Todd Farmer. Todd Farmer is one half of the creative team that is him and Patrick Lussier. Patrick Lussier was originally like an editor for Wes Craven on some of the Scream films and some of his Dimension projects. The two of them have not only made they would go on to make My Bloody Valentine in 3D, Drive Angry 3D on for Nicolas Cage, but also the cult classic uh, Trick on Shudder. A lot of people really like that as like a modern day slasher. This was his first ever like film, and so Jim Isaac and Sean S. Cunningham wanted to make a film and just to keep Jason relevant. That was it. It wasn't a rights thing. They just wanted to make sure that like the audience was still staying in touch with him. Which, if this is a thing after, if this is the best thing they can do after 9 years, I'm curious to see what they're gonna do after this whole rights debacle that we've been in for the last decade.
The what
Anyways,
debacle?
the rights debacle.
Oh,
That's the
right.
reason why we haven't it's the reason why we haven't seen any Friday the 13th or Jason Voorhees projects since 2009.
Well,
Has
there's a
been
Camp Crystal Lake series coming out on Peacock here soon.
there is, but
Yep.
that's literally the first one, and that's because of the rights between there's a rights debate between the Friday the 13th from 1980s writer Victor, I don't remember his last name, but also Sean S. Cunningham as the
Oh,
producer.
yeah, I know what you're talking about, where they kept it all tied up in court for like the last
Yep.
decade and it's finally settled. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So, Todd Farmer, the gentleman who played the what part did he actually play in this movie? He was
Private
the
Dallas.
Private Dallas. So Dallas in this movie also wrote this movie. He approached Isaac and Cunningham and said, "Hey, this is the movie that I have." This was literally the only pitch that they took for a next Jason movie following Jason Goes to Hell. And he simply said that sending Jason into space is the only means to advance the series. And they were sold on that.
I mean,
So
it's Hollywood, so I suspect there may have been drugs involved in that decision.
Yeah, most decisions are made with various drugs or alcohol or both. I mean, and what is it wrong that I feel a little badly for New Line? This was the first Jason movie they rolled out.
this is the second one they rolled out because they had the rights
Oh, that's right. They
in
did
Jason Goes to
to
Hell.
hell. That's right. Never mind. Yeah, so
Yeah.
they didn't have a good track record.
Yeah, no, they didn't. And like I know like me and you differed on Hell, and we'll probably differ on at Freddy versus Jason. But yeah, they mostly didn't have a good track record based on like some of like the movies from the Paramount era. But I will say this, I respect New Line that like I will respect New Line for the Jason Voorhees decisions that they made, because they went and like they got gutsy and like try different things than just like we're gonna put him back in Camp Crystal Lake. They did a whole thing with like him being a part of like a hellspawn. They did him in space. They pitted him against another slasher icon. And while I feel like these movies aren't necessarily the best the franchise has, I still respect them that they're going out and doing something completely different.
Yeah, and different is good. The only concern I had with it, like when they took it over, is I feel like they tried to retcon it to be more like Nightmare on Elm Street, where they wanted to give Jason more lore and something like specific, which is what they started with in Hell, with the whole Voorhees special Voorhees knife, and
Sure.
it's a lineage. It was like taking Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street lore and sticking and fusing them together and giving it to Jason. And it just at that point, you're already 9 films in. It just felt weird.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below, wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
Yeah. I mean, it's fairly clear what I think of this movie. It's it's like they didn't really have a valid idea, and this was going on with a lot of movies at that time. We're going to do this, but in space. I think was it Ghosts of Mars might have even come out around this time too.
Yeah, Ghost of Mars comes out 5 months after this movie because it was for August 2021.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, if you look what was going on as the trend at the time, it was kind of to be expected when you think about it, but it doesn't make it right.
Which, yeah. So that to me is like really, it's looking back on this era of horror is really weird because of stuff like that, to where like we had felt like we had kind of like sucked the revival of slasher movies from the Scream era out to the point where, they were eventually a parody target with Scary Movie. And so then you're like, all right, well, we have to, it almost feels like you're scrambling again to kind of like, what's the next wave of horror? And this is definitely like that in-between wave where it definitely feels like we're going to go for like a more sci-fi approach, to where we're going to send Jason to hell, Pinhead to space, Jason to space. We're going to do Ghost of Mars, send Ice Cube to space, John Carpenter to space, like this entire era. And then like it's a few years like shy of what would eventually go on to become the next big wave of remakes and torture porn.
Yeah, there was a period of almost what do we do with the genre for a little while.
And like I also think that like, and I also feel like we're kind of in that era now where with these iconic slashers, it's like we're in a new age with streaming and you're also like trying to figure out like how do we get people to the cinema. And so you're in this era now that you were back then, is like, how do we take these classic 80s icons and make them relevant again? And I think for the most part, like with Halloween's recent success, we don't have to talk about Halloween Ends.
I don't
No.
I don't know what you're talking about. What is this
I know.
Halloween Ends? There's a class of movie that are so bad and horrible that I don't recognize their existence. And yeah,
That's fair. You guys can hear our episode on it as well.
What are you talking
Well,
about?
there are also horror movies that aren't really horror movies where that
Yeah,
I think that one falls into that category.
absolutely. But I say all of that to say that like I feel like we're in this not necessarily recession of slasher movies, but like the classic legacy ones are becoming increasingly more difficult to make relevant. And honestly, I feel like at this point, for as much as I love a lot of these characters, if it's not going to be good, stop making it.
No, what are you crazy?
I mean,
You don't understand film companies at all.
I don't. I'm a fan 100%, and
I mean,
I have hot takes, but continue, Mark.
at the same time, though, what are you going to do with the slasher to not make it like the other 150,000 slashers that are out there? Somebody's just going to walk around and kill everybody.
Yeah, you're absolutely not wrong.
There's your plot for every slasher. Somebody's walking around killing everybody. So,
but I think also at the same time, like you can definitely make it like unique to where like you can make it like a character study, and I think we most certainly have gotten that with the Pearl trilogy of from Ty West this past year, to where you're taking a singular character, rotating them and developing them. Whereas like when you look at like Jason Voorhees, it's like Anthony was saying, like they had a lore going. Jason was bullied, Jason drowned, came back to life. He was a mama's boy, and now he's going after vengeance. Like that's what makes him tick. New Line kind of like messed around with that to where they're like, he's supernatural. He's technically like a demon parasite, and then like now we're trying to figure out what makes him tick, and like giving him mock Jason, and I think that's what Mecha Jason or whatever he's called, like the final form in this movie.
Uber Jason.
Jason. Okay. But yeah, like I think that they definitely like have tried to do that, and you can definitely see that like there's a struggle, and that's again like. But Mark, like to your point, like these are the formulas for a slasher. Like, how do you reinvent them by the time that you get around to entry 9 or 10 in your franchise?
But then
you send in the space.
Yeah. but then you end up with stuff like Happy Death Day. Happy Death Day, it's still a slasher, but they had fun with it. Yeah. And they gave you at least they crossed Groundhog's Day with a slasher for the first one, and they brought in elements of Back to the Future for the second one. And they actually almost pretty much tell you that in the movie. But they were fun movies that weren't like quite like the rest of the slashers, but they were still somebody going around killing people. It's still the same basic story in slashers. So it's at this point, I think it's more of, do we just remake more slashers that people loved again, or do we try to come up with something original that's pretty much just going to have the same story no matter what you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and film companies will always lean towards going with established franchises because it already has a built-in audience base. So that's the reason why it's like, as much as you want them to stop, they're not going to, because they still know it's like a good chunk of people will still come see it no matter what, because Jason is in it, Freddy is in it, Ghostface is in it, even if it's bad.
Now, like, also, like, correct me if I'm wrong. Like, Mark, I think, yeah, I agree with both the points you guys are making. Like Anthony, like obviously like notable IPs are always going to like be first priority for studios. Warner Brothers is a great example for this year. Like you look at their slate for every film that they're doing, everything is either a reboot, a reimagining, or a sequel in some way, shape, or form. There is no original content that is coming out from Warner Brothers or New Line this year. It's terrible.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why they got bought out by Discovery.
Yeah, but like I think like to Mark's point that like these movies also like they're the same basic plot through and through. Like, and of course, like for some of them you have different things about them that make them unique. Like Freddy Krueger obviously is the dream demon. Like so there's a supernatural twist that's like flown there. And obviously you have the Laurie Strode, Michael Myers connection for Halloween. But I would argue that like for nowadays the films that even for like these movies from like the 2000s to the present, I feel like this era of horror, like yes, it might be the same thing, but also keep in mind that like what also sets them apart and helps make them different is the creativity that you can have with the gags. So like the Texas Chainsaw we got early last year is a great example. Like it was really divisive, but the one common thing that you can say is that bus sequence was great. And I think that like the deaths and how they're carried out in some of these modern day slashers and the creativity that you can spin around that also are what kind of help differ and make things excellent or at least watchable and passable by like slasher standards of today. And I definitely think that like again, this one had that great frozen death sequence and it never ever hits to that level of creativity ever again.
Was there ever really any creativity outside of the first like two Friday the 13th? So the creativity went into thinking of different ways to cut people up.
You can hear all of our conversations from the previous Friday the 13th, wherever you guys get your podcast, Search Victims and Villains.
But I do agree that that's really all they are about. I agree with you, Mark. It's really how do you cut people up in different ways? But there are still attempts that get made in certain franchises. I'll go to Scream because I actually thought Scream last year did something different and interesting in the sense of they took the legacy characters, brought them back, but the purpose was to transition to a new group, a new set of characters to kind of continue the franchise while rebooting it at the same time. And I think I forgot what they called it in the movie. But
a requel.
I actually liked the approach they did with it. I'm not going to say I agree with everything they did, but I liked the approach that they did, and I thought that was good. It's just with other franchises, it's really hard to do that, especially with like a Friday the 13th, where it really is everybody dies, and the people who wind up surviving aren't developed enough that you care to bring them back. There's not enough that, and that's the biggest problem with these. There's not enough character development where it's like, oh, I want to see this person come back for the sequel to fight him again. It's like, no, we don't even know who they are. They're just the final, they're just the survivor.
Wait, are you telling me that a robot who wants nipples doesn't count as character development? That's ludicrous.
What? Well, I guess that's character development. When I told after I watched this, and actually after I threw away $3 to rent it because I don't own it, I actually had to pay to watch this, and I want a refund. I definitely want a refund. And I did just looking at it, it just reminded me so much of how much they I feel like they literally ripped off Aliens. It's like in so many ways with the robot and the army and, obviously, the killer in space type of thing. Like it was like somebody watched even the professor who reminded me of like, oh, I go, this is like the the D version of Paul Reiser's role in Aliens. I'm like, I just thought like they took that script and said, let's make a Jason movie out of this for the least amount of money we can spend, and use all the cheap CGI that is now affordable, in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so as much as I like horror, as much as I like a lot of these slashers and their series, the one thing that always kind of bugged me and probably bugged a lot of people is they couldn't keep the stories and backgrounds consistent. They were constantly, even in direct sequels, constantly trying to reinvent and reimagine and alter the character to fit their storyline instead of making the storyline fit the character. And this is kind of another one of those things. We're just randomly going to place them in an environment and we're going to write a story around it.
Well,
Yeah.
like you get. Sorry, go ahead, Anthony.
No, I was just agreeing with that. You're absolutely right. It's like, why build the character when we can just think of a cool new scenario?
Yeah, it's a bad habit they have now in comic books too. They keep retconning long time characters to fit other things. They even went as far as to retcon Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch so they would match the movies, as opposed, yeah, things like that. They do it in comic books horribly. They retcon them all the time and change what they're capable of doing. And in horror franchises like this, it's, oh, he was coming back for vengeance. No, he's really an undead revenant. No, he's an alien parasite. And they do a bunch of things like that in a lot of the franchises, and it kind of takes away from it. But it's also during a time period when they're trying to figure out how to handle the genre as a whole, as opposed to now everything gets nitpicked for having a plot hole of some sort. So it's I think it's also, we're looking at it kind of as a sign of how movies are now, where if there's not every plot hole plugged, then it gets nitpicked to death these days. Where back in the 80s and 90s, we were watching it for entertainment value and nobody really cared that the story wasn't consistent as to who Jason and Freddy and Michael Myers were.
I think a large portion of that comes from the rise of like Rotten Tomatoes and like YouTube, where anyone with a camera now can like review films and like throw their 2 cents out there. And like, I'm speaking as someone that does that. I'm speaking as someone that podcasts about it. I'm speaking as someone that writes about film, that YouTube's about film, that, looks at that kind of stuff, like even like not associated with victims or abyss gazing or that's high praise, like doing it like with Letterboxd on like for fun. I think that that's really helped. Like, don't get me wrong, like there are still films that like I love that I know are bad. Like I will throw my hands early. I love Freddy versus Jason. I think it's a fun film. I love Hellraiser 3. I love Showgirls. I loved I loved the Texas Chainsaw 2022. Like there are multiple movies that are like in my regiment that I actively love and I'm passionate about, and I know that they have plot holes or are just mindless entertainment. And at the end of the day, like I'm gonna like what I'm gonna like. But Mark, to go back to what you were talking about with like there's no continuity, like I think you even have that here for like the transition between Jason Goes to Hell and Jason X, because essentially the ending to Freddy versus Jason, or the ending to Jason Goes to Hell, is an entry point into Freddy versus Jason. This film is literally a placeholder in every sense of that word, because none of the events of Jason Goes to Hell affect Jason X, and none of the events of Jason X affect the events of Freddy versus Jason. Like this literally just seems like a placeholder while they were trying to figure out how to do Freddy versus Jason.
Well, they had a small placeholder in the opening. You see them like coming up through hell or whatever. So they had a very small, tiny, minuscule connection, and the fact that they were in, yes.
Am I the only one that missed this?
That's like the opening credits to the movie.
Well, you know what's funny? I think of all the things you can debate in this film, the opening credits, because when you watch it, I felt the same way at the beginning, Mark. Like the first 30 to 60 seconds of the film, I thought was, oh, this is Jason coming back up from hell. But then as the credits continued to, go, it became more like, oh, it's Jason's body kind of
That's what I thought.
regenerating combined with, and then they were going with whatever he's being injected with, going through the bloodstream and stuff. So I think you can debate that either way, or both of those are in there. Because I thought that at first too. I thought, oh, Jason's coming back from hell. I'm like, no, wait, they're doing the whole science regeneration thing. It's confusing.
Yeah, because that's what I took it as. I was like, I took it as like the regeneration, because like I really liked Jason Goes to Hell, and again, I know it's like a hot take. I know at this point it's a cult classic.
I mean, I saw Jason Goes to Hell in the theater.
Nice.
Yeah.
So did I.
But like the whole thing about that is that like he was a demon spawn, so like he could transfer his body from like one person to another, and that's why I didn't like look at the opening credits and be like, this is a great callback to Jason Goes to Hell. Like I just took it as Anthony said it, like this is science. This is them studying regeneration.
And then the research facility at the beginning is Camp Crystal Lake or Crystal Lake Research Facility?
It's Crystal Lake Research Facility.
Yeah, they got very Crystal Lake got very high tech and
Well, it also should be mentioned that I think the beginning of this movie they said that takes place in 2010, so it's already passed. But we're
2010, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We're about a year away, and I'm super sorry to say this, Anthony, from hockey being outlawed, because
yes,
apparently that's a thing.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, when they said that in the movie, I completely forgot that line, and I'm like, you lost me now. Go away. This film sucks.
What is a hockey mask? What is hockey? Hockey was a primitive sport that was outlawed in 2024.
Yeah, because going to space and being stupid like all these people are is just way more beneficial to society.
Which, all right, so like we've talked about like the era of slashers and horror movies in this era, but can we talk about the era of like the new millennium? Like it's not just horror, it was like on kids shows, it was like in other like sci-fi movies. Like the 2000 to like 2003 had this like era of films and like television episodes / projects where we imagined how the future was gonna look like, but it still looked like the year 2000. And this movie painfully looks like this. Like I'm like, there's no like creativity. They're like, this is what we imagine. It's just gonna be 2000 fashion, but in 150 years.
Well, looking at it like that, look at things like Star Trek and Star Wars. All the aliens are essentially humanoid for the most part. And then you had Geiger design the alien. And he actually stated in an interview that people were too busy creating creatures in their image, essentially. And that's part of what makes the alien so unusual and unsettling as a creature.
Sure.
So you had people trying to imagine what the future was going to be like based on what they know. Look at Blade Runner. Blade Runner, that time period, I think, is already passed. And they did it back in like the 80s. And it did an okay job. It kind of looks like a take on Gotham. Yeah. But they were still basing it on what they knew at the time and trying to add what they thought might be that advancement. And that's kind of what happened with this.
Yeah. And also on top of that, I was just gonna say on top of that, also, it's just it's just human nature. I mean, we're naturally going to believe as storytellers that obviously the human race is going to survive and everything is going to continue to be built in our image. And on top of that, but budgetary reasons, everything, if it doesn't look like Earth, it's going to cost you a lot of money to make up something completely new.
I mean, then you have like you're not wrong, but then you have like old school movies like Forbidden Planet that like kind of like also allowed really push the genre on like what like at least what you could do like visually to where it like still looks like Earth, but you can tell that it's not.
Yeah, I mean there are. I mean, I'm not going to say that people didn't try and succeed. There are people who did. But I'm just saying for the majority, I think a lot of people just automatically assume it's like we need to connect this to the human audience. So we don't want to go too far out there. We want to make people feel like, oh, okay, this still seems a little bit familiar, even though it's like the future. It still seems familiar to us.
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
I guess I don't know. Like, and like even like when I was growing up, and I'm gonna age myself here, so I apologize to the both of you. Even when I was growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I was watching like things that were like on Nickelodeon and like how those creators and those writers interpreted the years. Like there's a Keenan Kel episode where they take place in the year 3000. Like everything still feels like very much like this is how we imagine, you know, like everything is going to look like in 20 years from now. The Simpsons did a great episode about it where it's like flying cars and you know, stuff like that, but like you still very much like retain it. And maybe some of that is like Anthony, where you're talking about like maybe that's just like the pride of like the human race, that like in order to like feel connected to something, like we needed something to be in our image, and in order to feel feelings for something, like it needs to look like us or feel like us to be a humanoid. And that kind of thing is like that's why I'm like, you know, grateful. Mark, you brought up comics earlier. Like I'm really grateful for like I think Guardians of the Galaxy is a perfect example of that, because it feels like, yes, you're still retaining that, but like you're also spending time with a talking tree and raccoon. So like you don't have to like feel like you have to have a lot of these connections to like humanoid type characters. Like, yes, they still look like us to some respects, but then you like on the flip side of that, like you also have like talking dogs and like other aspects.
But your lead is what really connects you, because the lead is a human.
Yeah. And parts of science that people are upset with, human testing or animal testing and experiment.
Yeah.
So there's still that human connection to characters like Rocket.
That's fair. So before we end this episode, I was like really racking my brain like with mental health aspects of here, and like I know we were joking, like probably watching this movie like would be better for you for mental health before we started. But I think the opening prologue to this movie with David Cronenberg's character of like being insistent on like needing to like study Jason and like know Jason, I think that is how we need to approach the subject of mental health. Because one of the things that I find in doing events for victims, and whether that's cons or even our film festival, Horrific Hope, one of the things that I've been finding out is that there's a lot of ignorance out there. Like, we understand that like depression and like suicide and like alcoholism and like things along those lines, that they are an issue, but we don't understand the gravity of how many people are affected daily by them. And education is very vital, and it's very important. I think that like in terms, if you're going to talk about the mental health of this movie, I think that education is a big argument to have.
I think that's the best connection you can make with this film. I really do. After, I mean, I don't know how else to, with these films, sometimes it's really hard to find something to make that connection, Josh. And I know it's what you always seek out. I think you're spot on, because after that scene in the beginning, everything is just bonkers.
Yeah. And I mean, like, you could also make the argument of like KM's character arc throughout the course of this being like an important one for us, because like I think at the end of the day, like, we talked about like the rise of YouTube and like TikTok and like just creator content. You have people that are like eagerly seeking to be seen and to be heard and to be validated. And I think that that's her arc in this movie, for as cheesy as it is really beautiful of the human condition, because we want to be seen and we want to be heard and we want to be loved. Like, that's her whole arc, is that like she basically just wants to be seen as something that is not a robot, but something that is to be loved by her creator. And I think that that is such a beautiful thing to like also talk about. And so like in the end, where she finally gets to kiss the creator dude whose name I don't even remember.
Oh, his name I always remember because it's so weird. It's Sunaran.
Yeah, so Sudaron, like, and KM, like when they finally kiss, like you can kind of see that like she got what she wanted the entire film. And it's this really cheesy but like really satisfying reward for her to be like, okay, like I can go do this now because I'm seen, I'm heard, and I'm heard. And at the end of the day, like I am loved. And I think that like depression has this way of unraveling a lot of those truths that, there are people in our lives that will love us, that will care about us, that will see us and hear us for everything that we do, both good and bad. And depression likes to keep it to where you're saying, oh no, that's not a thing.
Yeah, and it all kind of, the symptoms are similar, but it varies from person to person in severity as well.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you there too. It does vary, but Josh, you did touch on a good point with KM, where she is that arc that that most people struggle with, where they just want to be accepted for who they are and what they want to be. Yeah, I mean it's probably the most poignant thing in the entire film. Even though it's not, obviously it's, this is not a film that's going to dive deep into that stuff, but it's probably it's the closest you get for sure.
I think also that it makes it like the most timely theme here too, because like never in all of history have so many different people groups been fighting for that validation and like the equality of rights, whether you're talking about the African American community, women's rights, abortion rights / birth control rights, the LGBTQIA plus community, like so many different like people groups that are just looking and like, I would dare say like shouting to be heard and to be seen. And I think that like the thoroughness of KM's ability to kind of like also like pursue that from the dude's whose name has a weird name I can't remember. Sunaran, I think is a great example of that. And like it makes this movie for as outdated as it feels, that particular theme and element of the movie does make it very timely to where it feels almost like we're holding up a mirror, and KM is the personification of multiple people groups fighting for validation and equality.
And I'm sure that's exactly what Todd Farmer was thinking when he wrote that character.
Yeah.
Todd, yeah,
I think as much as this is like the serious part of the show, I think you had to stretch a lot of threads to come up with this from this movie.
I did, but you know that it
But
just goes back to that. But yeah, it just goes back to that proof that, like, you know, for as much as like media can be not the greatest, like Jason X, it can still teach us stuff and challenge us as the audience to grow and have conversations about mental health.
No, you are correct there. I think with enough conversation, because we've gone all over the place with this one.
Absolutely.
And have not talked very, we haven't talked a great deal about the film specifically. But after all the conversations we just had, yeah, you can always find a way to pull a nugget of connection.
I mean, like, is there a whole lot really we can really talk about? Like, A, this movie's a placeholder for the film to come and next in the franchise. B, Jason goes to space, does really anticlimactic killing. That's it.
True.
Gets blown up.
Yes.
Yeah. That's yeah.
I mean, there's not really like a whole else that like you can like really defer from here.
It's not a deep movie.
No.
I think I've seen puddles after a rainstorm that are deeper than this movie is.
Wow.
So you're not watching this movie for inner perspective or anything. It's like I said, you're having to perform some massive mental gymnastics to come up with some sort of mental health theme based on this movie. But you're not watching it for that. People watch this movie because of how ridiculous it is, and because it's so cheesy. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, I think the writing in this movie, like, for as much as like we've been like bagging on Todd Farmer, I don't think this is like his best movie that he's ever written. I think this movie is definitely like, it's definitely cheesy, it's definitely over the top, and
but is it considered successful because of how much of kind of almost that cult classic status it's managed to achieve?
I will say that this movie is it's not financial success. It actually lost a great deal of money. For one, I mean, I could have made money back on video sales. I don't know, rentals. However, I will say that the fact that this movie is now like a cult status, it has a success in its own right. And I'm sorry, like, if anyone like listened to this and was just like really angry that like we didn't like it. I'm glad, and I'm really happy that like Jason X means a lot to a good deal to people. Like, I think that everyone's entitled to their own opinions and is, you know, allowed to have these like thoughts of like, this is a good movie, this is a bad movie, and not really have to like dive into like really defend that about like what makes it a good movie or what makes it a bad movie. I think for all of us, I think the general consensus is that this movie is it looks cheap. It feels cheesy. It's really campy, and it really leans into that. And I'm like, it understands and like knows the assignment it's going for. I think that's part of the reason that makes it as charming as it actually is.
And it all, from what I understand, I'm looking it up online, it also just broke even financially based off of the rental I did yesterday.
Good to know. Well, I think that's going to do it for us. We'll be back later this year talking about Freddy versus Jason, the long awaited showdown to this movie. And there's a great book out there called Slash of the Titans that kind of just dissects every kind of concept. There was dozens of concepts and things that they heard before actually moving into this. So who knows? Maybe with that one we'll get a little bit deeper. We'll try and seek out like original ideas that were rejected and kind of talk about that. But that's way down the line, way down the line. So Anthony, where can people find you online?
Well, not with films, but with video games, as Josh already knows. You can find me on the Retro Gamers podcast every Tuesday. And that's on Facebook.com/Retro Gamers Podcast, on Instagram @Retro Gamers Podcast, on Twitter @Retro Gamers Pod. You can listen to us wherever you listen to podcasts, and we're on YouTube @Retro Gamers Podcast.
What are you playing right now?
Right now, I am not playing anything retro. I'm working on at the moment. I've been enamored with Power Wash Simulator on my Steam Deck, where it's exactly as it sounds. I have been power washing for the last week.
Okay, didn't know that was a game.
It's oddly therapeutic. It just is. Take my word for
there are
it.
some weird games out there, like Job Simulator.
Yep.
There's Surgeon Simulator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's some Goat Simulator.
Yes, but I will say nothing as calming as just power washing a home or a vehicle. It's weird. So I'm playing that right now, and I'm working on the Avengers on PS5, which I am not enjoying.
If you guys are like watching this on Patreon, patreon.com/victims and villains, you guys get the video version of this, and I am just honestly perplexed of the complexity that has come from the state of video games to where we are in power washing and goat simulations now.
Yes.
What a time to be alive.
There's a goose simulator too.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
You had me a goose simulator.
There you go.
And don't forget Maneater, where you get to be a shark terrorizing a tropical resort.
I did play some of that.
You also have Stray, where you get to be like a stray cat. So
Stray was such a beautiful game. I think it might have been my favorite game of last year.
Nice.
I mean, I did put over 300 hours into Elden Ring last year. So
holy cow.
Yeah.
And from what I heard, worth every minute.
Yeah, because you find different. I think part of the reason the Soulsborne style games do as well as they do isn't just so much the challenge, but the way you can respec and play the game differently. Because the different style weapons play differently. So it forces you to adapt to the weapon and play differently than you played previously. So yeah, I spent a lot of time last year on Elden Ring, and I'm playing Callisto Protocol right now, and I got the PS5 patch for The Witcher 3, and I'm replaying that too.
Nice. Very nice. Elden Ring I purposely didn't pick up because I didn't want a game that I knew would suck me in for at least 100 hours.
Yeah, it took me something like 150 to 100 to beat it the first time, and that was just because I was exploring every little thing, and then I looked and found out I was just a couple trophies short of getting a platinum in the game.
Oh no.
It was it was like two side bosses I missed and like a couple little things like that. So I went through it again, and I did what everybody said: save it just before the final boss fight, and then you can go back in and do the boss fight again and get the last ending. Well, I made the mistake of getting the one ending that forces you to get that ending, so I had to play through it a third time.
Oh, damn.
Nice.
Which took me about 8 hours because I just kind of steamrolled all the bosses.
That's
Mark,
awesome.
where can people find you online?
Still yet to be updated Instagram account for miniature painting. Yes. Oh, you look like you were going to say something.
No, I was just stretching, dude.
Yeah, I need to get some more models posted up there on Titanium Juggernaut Painting on Instagram.
So like I'm at this like crossroads where I love that like this is like now like an ongoing like joke and
Joke.
theme for our show. But like I'm also like debated like I could kill it and I could just like set alarms every day, just be like, Mark, post on Instagram, post on Instagram.
Well, it's so it's a couple different things. It's one, I don't have a whole lot of time. We got one kid in college, another one we're taking care of, jobs, pets, houses. I mean, just everything known to man. So I don't have a whole lot of time to kind of deal with some of the stuff. And the other is between what I have up now and what I'm doing now is a big jump in quality. And I want to figure out how to get better pictures so it shows. You know what I mean?
Lighting.
Well,
Lighting is
yeah,
a big
that
part.
too.
But Alan would be a good person to talk to about that. So anyways, she plugged for his show. Go check out You Have to Watch This podcast. You guys can find me. I'm on Letterboxd at Captain Nostalgia. I'm also on TikTok at Gent Ghostface GNT. And you guys can follow our podcast feed now wherever you guys get your podcasts. Just look up Abyss Gazing, horror podcast. We're officially on our own feed now, and you guys can follow our parent company. We're on Victims and Villains at victimsandvillains.net, where you guys will find links to their social, more podcasts on our podcast network, YouTube, Twitch, etc. And most importantly, our mental health resource library. Until next time, remember that the longer you gaze into the abyss, the more the abyss gazes back into you.